Welcome to this third short lecture, introduction to further conversation when we gather together. I want to acknowledge the Kurnai people, who are the traditional custodians of the land that I live on here in West Gippsland, and I want to acknowledge their elders past and present. I also want to acknowledge their religious and spiritual traditions that are thousands and thousands of years old. And I want to acknowledge that the intersection of Western Christianity with the religions of the Kurnai people and all other Australian Indigenous people have been experienced by them in ways that I cannot even begin to imagine. And so it is with that theological humility that I approach this question with you in this lecture. As you know, and I hope you've read the chapter from The Lamb Enters the Dreaming by Robert Kenny, the recounting of the conversion of Nathaniel Pepper and the ruptured, it's called Nathaniel Pepper and the Ruptured World, a book that examines, really from a unique perspective, the impact of the message of Christianity, in particular, the image of Jesus as the Lamb of God and the Good Shepherd on Indigenous religion and culture during the early days of colonialism in Australia. Now, I want to ask you to consider something that I find very challenging in my own life. I was raised with a view of Jesus that was warm and loving. Even though the Jesus that I grew up with was a Jesus also of judgment and dealing with sin, the Jesus that I have come to know throughout my exploration of the Christian tradition and the texts of the New Testament is a Jesus that I understand to be warmly inclusive, a preacher and doer of love, a critiquer of power and of dogma, and a person who looks in the margins and reaches out to those in the margins to bring them to the centre of the life of God through relationship. Now, all of that is a strong, powerful, and, in my view, deeply positive view, not only of the historical Jesus, but of the fact that Christianity takes those elements of the historical Jesus and claims that they are actually part of the very nature of God's self. What happens then when we read a perspective of Jesus taken from the lived experience of a colonised people? Certainly it appears that those who were the subject of the colonising efforts of England in the Australian nation experienced this new religion, this new spiritual tradition from Europe to be indistinguishable from the colonising. Religion, in fact, was part of everyday life and indeed part of the very earth and natural world with which Indigenous cultures lived, interacted, and on which they depended. And so for them, why would the religion of the colonising peoples be any less central to their views of the world, their understanding of the land, and so on? The power of Kenny's book is its capacity to reveal that Jesus was perceived by Indigenous peoples as a significant element of the Western dreaming, the colonising dreaming. And the depiction of Jesus in the Christian tradition as Lamb of God, as the Good Shepherd, and the sacrificial lamb all fit quite well with an Indigenous understanding of this new religion of Jesus as relating to the land in the same ways that the sheep that they actually experienced as part of the colonising of their land related to the land. And so the Jesus they experienced was not in harmony with the land. Rather, the Jesus they experienced was an invader, an imposter, in fact, a parasite on the land, and appeared in no way to be part of the great spiritual network of life that Indigenous religions so beautifully lived with and depicted. Now, this is really challenging for me, and that's why this lecture is a bit more personal. How do I respond to the idea that that the experience that Indigenous people had of sheep taking over and changing the very landscape was the same experience they had of Jesus? The religion that, whilst it may in many ways have protected them physically from the incredibly harsh reality of the squatters and their colonial approach, certainly sought to eradicate the spiritual and religious traditions of Indigenous people in a kind of religious and spiritual genocide. And I know that that word is contentious, and I use it intentionally to generate the conversation that I think needs to be had. When we gather, we're going to consider a work of art, a couple of works of art actually, by the artist Lynn Onus, in whose life is an intersection of two cultures. Lynn's mother was Scottish and his father was Yorta Yorta from the Murray River in northern Victoria. And Lynn Onus's art explores the intersection of these two cultures and seeks to understand how they interact and on what basis Indigenous people today are able to build their own new identity given all that has been lost. But I want you to consider carefully this question. Who is Jesus in Indigenous religion? Jesus was originally experienced as invader, as coloniser. In fact, the appropriation of Christianity by Indigenous peoples is a complex and problematic story to unravel. Much of it related to the desire to literally survive the colonial onslaught, the colonial invasion. The efforts of Indigenous Australians to build a new identity, to reconstruct Christianity on the basis of their own deep and long religious tradition are extraordinary. And one of those is represented in the work of Graham Paulson that I hope you've also read. So when we gather to discuss, we're going to discuss Jesus the Invader. Of course, Australian Indigenous cultures and communities were not the only ones who experienced Jesus as invader. Latin and South American cultures, indeed Islamic cultures in the Crusades, and all nations colonised by Occidental or Western Christian cultures have experienced Jesus as colonial invader, and there have been all kinds of responses to that, and we're just going to have a brief look at the Australian Indigenous response. So I encourage you to embrace this conversation, as uncomfortable as it may be if you're anything like me. And once again, I convey my own sense of inadequacy for the task, being a middle-class white male, the representative of the most powerful group of people in the world. It is impossible for me to speak on behalf of Indigenous people, and I would never attempt to do so. I can only draw from what they offer us in terms of their own reflections, and that is why we will draw on the work of Lynn Onus and the work of Graham Paulson in our conversation. I look forward to it.